That's when I sort of came to this realization that the truth does out in the end. And if you see it first and you say it, people will come and join you over time. You just have to steel yourself against the backlash in the meantime.
Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Hannah Frankman, and on today's episode, I'm talking to Jennifer Sey. If you aren't already familiar with Jennifer's story, you're in for a real treat with this episode. Jennifer was the former brand president of Levi's. She was next in line to be CEO. She was poised to be their first ever female CEO. And she was pushed to resign during the pandemic because of comments she made on Twitter about how schools should be reopening once we realized that COVID was not a great risk to kids, but that not being in school was. And in today's episode, we talk about Jennifer's history of speaking out against injustices, even when the world isn't ready to hear it. First, talking about her career as a professional gymnast and talking about the abuses that happen to young girls in the gymnastics community, and then speaking out against the COVID school closures. We talk about why she cares so much about schools being closed, why she cared about it enough to lose her job over it. We talk about her education, we talk about the education of her children, and we talk about raising brave children and how to raise kids who aren't afraid to think of for themselves and aren't afraid to say what they think, even if it's not always popular to do so. This was a really fantastic episode, and I really hope you enjoy listening. Jennifer, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I've wanted to have you on the show for a while. I'm very excited that you're here. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. It was good to meet you at Freedom Fest. That's how this came to be.
It was good to meet you at Freedom Fest, which is actually maybe an interesting starting point for our conversation because it was perhaps an unexpected place for us to meet. You as a very self-avowed liberal, for I don't know what term you prefer to use, for most of your life.
I would have called myself a left of center Democrat for many years. And now I'm a registered independent. I sort of consider myself politically homeless. Classical liberal might be a title I would embrace. Libertarian light, maybe I might embrace. Definitely not a member of many party. I am unaffiliated.
Yes, I relate to that also. I prefer to avoid labels as well. I find them a bit constrictive to just define the things that I believe in. But I think it's still an unexpected place perhaps for you to have found yourself at a conference like Freedom Fest after, your political beliefs for most of your life.
Yeah, I have found myself in many unexpected places in the last, couple of years. I'm embracing it and going with it. And I've met amazing people and we don't agree on everything, but, that's okay. We're able to talk about stuff and respectfully disagree and come together on the things that we do agree on, which I think is really important. Kind of look for the commonalities and the way of thinking that unites us and stop being so divided on the things that perhaps we don't agree on.
And that's one of the things that I find really interesting about your story in particular is you found your way here through education in part, which has always been interesting to me. I mean, obviously, education commentary is what I do, but I find it to be a very unique place to be doing commentary because it becomes very political and partisan, but at its core, it's very not, and it shouldn't be. And it's a thing that often unites unexpected people.
I think that's right, because we're all invested in our children and we're all invested in and recognize that their future is our collective future. And if we've not taught our children well, we're all at risk, and we're not teaching them well right now. I mean, unprecedented numbers are not able to read and do basic math. They're graduating from high school without basic skills to hold sort of just regular jobs. That's a problem for all of us. And that accelerated during COVID with the prolonged school closures, obviously. People can say we were on that path already, but in fact, scores had improved. Basic reading, basic math scores had improved over the last 2 to 3 decades. And now we're seeing scores from the nation's report card. The scores are lower than they've been in 30 years. That's a really frightening prospect.
To what extent pre-COVID was education a thing that you had a pulse on? Because obviously you started making waves on a national level when you started speaking up out against school closures, which we'll get to in a little bit. But how much was this a thing you cared about prior to that?
I cared about children, and my advocacy had been very much in the space of kids. It was focused on sports. I was an elite athlete, a gymnast as a child, and endured a really cruel and abusive training environment, and was outspoken about that since 2008 when I wrote a book called Chalked Up, which was really a memoir about my personal experience of abusive coaching in the sport. And I had some credibility. I was a national team member for 8 years. I was a national champion in 1986. That said, I was just dragged across the internet, just smeared relentlessly as a liar and a grifter and a really crappy ex-gymnast. So what did I know? Just bitter about not having made the Olympics. And I was sort of stunned at the kind of energy and the heft of the criticism from people who had trained with me, who knew exactly what it was like and that it was true. But I learned very quickly that when there are forces at play to kind of protect those in power, in this case, coaches, US Olympic Committee, governing bodies in individual sports, they will marshal any resources at their disposal to do that. And there's other factors at play too. It's really difficult when you come to terms with the fact that, you have been emotionally, physically, in some cases sexually abused in the sport. And I think for some people, they'd rather pretend it was all great because they got a medal, Anyway, so I became very involved in that space because I didn't want other children to have to go through what I had gone through, because it took me decades to get over it. As far as education, I have 4 children, 2 older, 2 younger, with a big space in between. And, honestly, and this may be at odds with kind of where your listeners are, but I believe very strongly, I had believed, and to some extent still do, but let me explain what I mean, in the public school system. I think that we have to have a strong public school system in this country, even if there are other choices and options available to people. The vast majority of children need to have access to a functional public school system. Not everyone can homeschool, and not everyone can go to private. I didn't want to send my children to the private schools in San Francisco when they were starting school in the mid-2000s. One, the pricing is exorbitant. We're talking $60,000, $70,000 a year. And while I ended up very successful in my career in the mid-2000s, that was not a remote possibility. But what I observed from the people that sent their children there, it was a very sort of fussy, pristine environment where you're not really exposed to anyone that's different than you. Everybody's the same. Everybody's super privileged. It just felt like raising veal in a pen to me. It was like not dealing with the real world. And I felt like if I live in the city, the reason I live in the city is because you meet all different kinds of people, you interact with all different kinds of people, and I want to be part of this community, and I want my children to be. I'm very lucky. My 2 older children, I'll get to the younger ones later, smart, disciplined, dedicated students. They did very well in the San Francisco public school systems. So I had no issue with that. That all got disrupted with COVID when the schools shut down and stayed closed for 18 months. So, that was a long answer to your question, but that's that. I wasn't particularly involved in education other than to, want my kids to participate in the public school system in San Francisco, involved to some extent in the schools we were in, but not on a broader scale than that.
You talk a little bit in your book about why you cared so much about school closures, that became the thing that you became very vocal about, that ultimately led to you leaving Levi's, which we'll get into a little bit as well. But can you talk a little bit about what you were seeing when schools were closed, beyond the just blatant hypocrisies of what people were and were not allowed to do, and the fact that schools being closed was very irrational, but also some of the damages that you were seeing both with your own kids, who I imagine were probably a little more sheltered from some of the harms that other kids were experiencing,
Sure.
and what you were seeing, because your kids were in public school. So you had a community of people who were much more boots on the ground than perhaps a lot of your peers at Levi's were. What were some of the things you were seeing that made you want to be vocal about this?
Well, I mean, to be really frank, it was hard to see anything. We literally weren't allowed out of our houses in San Francisco. I mean, you weren't allowed more than a few blocks from your house. You weren't allowed to congregate in outdoor areas like parks. So you had to imagine what was happening, which was not that hard to imagine. I knew the public school population. My children had been in those schools for many, many years. I had kids of all ages. So I had a student in college in the University of California state system. I had one in high school, a junior, and then I had one about to start kindergarten and another one in preschool. So I had kind of all the ages. And yes, my kids to some extent were protected from some of the worst harms, but you cannot protect them from the isolation, to be clear. It doesn't matter. I mean, unless you're just out and out cheating, which some people did, but not so much in San Francisco. Well, they did. They had their learning pods. There were people that were clean enough and safe enough, and they brought in tutors to, teach the younger children. But, my kids weren't home alone. My older children weren't having to tend to the younger ones. They could focus on their schoolwork. We had strong Wi-Fi, all of that. But yet, still, the isolation was difficult to combat. But because I had been in the public school system for, at that point, 12, 13 years with my older two kids, I knew that student population. I knew their friends. I knew that they were, most of them, in more challenging circumstances at home, perhaps alone, perhaps watching their younger siblings, maybe not as disciplined of students as my kids were, and needed that kind of discipline and focus of the classroom. Too many distractions, not strong Wi-Fi, parents who kind of worked graveyard shift. Like, it's just not that hard to imagine that for most kids, this was an impossible and untenable situation. So I was very outspoken from the very beginning, from March 2020. I was actually opposed to all of it, lockdowns and everything, but I didn't talk about that publicly in the same way. I thought children, to your point earlier, would be sort of a bridge issue that people could come together on. And I was, believe it or not, trying to protect my job, which was unsuccessful in the end. After 2 years of advocating for children in open public schools, I was told there wasn't a job for me anymore, and ultimately left on my own, which we can get to at the end. But it didn't seem to me, look, I lived in the city in San Francisco. I lived in a very nice neighborhood in a very nice apartment. 1 block over is subsidized housing. Those are, 2-room SROs, or families are living in these 2-room apartments with lots and lots of people. These are my neighbors. The playgrounds are closed, so the children can't even go play in the complex. They can't go outside. They're stuck in it's not that hard to imagine that this was going to be really bad for kids' physical health and mental health, not to mention, in many instances, they'd literally be at risk because they're home by themselves. So I just was activated by that. And I to this day don't understand why that was hard for people to imagine. But I guess if you're so removed from the people in the city, the real people in the city, because you live in a gated community and, take a black car to work every day, then you don't know, and you think you're brave. And
it wasn't just the people who are in their gated communities who didn't see it, though. A lot of people who were part of the public school system and their kids were part of the public school system also advocated for school closures. It was a very unexpected, I think, position that a lot of people started finding themselves in when they were in the minority speaking against this.
Yeah, and minority, I mean, it was like me in San Francisco and my husband. I mean, you can't even imagine the minority that we were. I do think as things progressed, beyond spring of 2020, there were more people that were starting to question, but it became so polarized. And, they had observed what happened to people like me for speaking out. You were called all sorts of awful things, from a racist to a murderer to a conspiracy theorist. And your job, it's not wrong to say you put your reputation, your job, and your social circle at risk. And so even, I think, when people started to ask questions, they were too afraid to say anything. And they sort of cobbled together an existence that maybe kind of worked. And there was, in a place like San Francisco, there was so much virtue if you kind of stayed home and stayed safe. It was like you were doing good in the world by doing nothing. And even if you were actually harming your own children and not really listening and understanding what was going on with them. But I will say this, 2 years in, well, the schools didn't open until the fall of 21. In the spring of 2022, 3 members of the San Francisco School Board were recalled decisively by like 70% of the voters that voted in this off-cycle election voted to recall, which says to me there were a lot of people that agreed with me, maybe not right in the beginning, but somewhere into the process, but were too afraid to stand up and say anything because of the reputational harm that would come. But they did it at the ballot box. So.
Why do you feel like so many people were so afraid to speak out? I mean, obviously, you're a walking example of what happens when you speak out, but you were willing to in spite of the cost. And you talked a little bit too. I'd also like to hear you talk a little bit about how you tried to protect your job because, what you did
I failed.
ultimately led to you being told basically you need to resign.
Yeah.
And yet you were willing to, I assume you knew from the beginning that you were taking that risk, that this was a possible outcome, or did you not know? Did you think you'd be able to protect?
I didn't know from the beginning. I thought everybody would come around. I thought it would be so obvious. I was reading data from the beginning. It was clear the age stratification of risk. I thought, you have to remember the experience I described in gymnastics. I first spoke out in 2008. It was 10 years later that everybody came around, and it took a catastrophic event being exposed, which was the fact that Dr. Larry Nassar, who had been the coach of Team USA the doctor of Team USA Gymnastics for 30 years, was sexually abusing young athletes during that entire time. When that story, not when the story broke, because when the story broke, people still kind of pushed back and blamed the victims. But by the time he was convicted, I was kind of hailed as a hero who spoke first. And of course, everybody said they always supported me, which they didn't. But I guess what I held close to my kind of heart and my mind is that the truth does usually out in the end. Now, I guess what I forgot was with gymnastics, it took 10 years. I thought it might go a little faster because to me, the facts were so obvious that children were not at risk and that we should not use children to protect the elderly. The data was all there and available from the very beginning. And then as early as April and May, you had schools across Europe opening and saying the harms to children were too great. I thought that would break through and people would come to their senses. That did not happen. Certainly not in time for me to keep my job. I would say somewhere by the end of 2020, I realized that was a risk that I was taking, and I was willing to take it anyway.
Why?
Well, I certainly hoped it wouldn't happen. I still had confidence in my ability to kind of convince people. I thought I kept having these little moments where I was like, they're going to see it now, right? Like all the private schools opened in San Francisco in the fall. All my peers sent their kids back to school. I thought, okay, now they'll see it. They all are desperate and want to send their kids back. They're going to see that it's only fair that 50,000 pounds. Nope, wrong. Like I underestimated the depths of hypocrisy. But how could you not be? That's the thing I don't understand. Like if you're not willing to stand on your principles, which for me in this case were, I value free speech and children. Those are the two things I'm willing to die on a hill for. What are yours? And if you don't have any, then what's wrong with you? But I think most people don't have any. And I think history proves that. It's not just COVID. Most people would rather stand with the group than stand out and do the right thing. And we've seen it time and time again across eras and geographies. Now, those people can be coaxed out, but only once there's critical mass and they feel like they're not really taking a risk. And so, but that's just not how I look at it. And I think the risks of not standing up for children and speech, which is probably the most fundamental freedom we have, are greater than me losing my job. I'll figure this out.
Yeah, I obviously deeply agree with you. These are principles I also hold near and dear to my heart. Obviously, that's what I do all day is talk about the kids.
Yeah.
But it's surprising to me how many people will come out for something like an election and vote, but aren't willing to face the social repercussions of being more vocal publicly, which both make sense in terms of human nature, but also the numbers are sometimes surprising. And I think people have a lot of fears that a lot of the things that happened to you will also happen to them, that they'll lose a job, that they'll
That's
they'll be
legit.
ostracized from their family, that they'll lose friends. And obviously
That's legit.
happened.
Yeah.
Was it just raw courage for you, or was it more a miscalculation of how people would respond? Miscalculations maybe a strong word, but like a misunderstanding, an over optimism of people being able to.
Yeah, I think in the beginning it was perhaps a miscalculation or being overly optimistic, which isn't necessarily how I'd describe myself, but and combined with perhaps a little too much confidence in my ability to communicate and stay calm. I set that aside very quickly as the blowback intensified. I don't think it's courage. It's just sort of like a principle. It's like, I believe this. Kids are being harmed. Free speech is fundamental to living in a free society. If I don't, I'm just some person, like, but if we don't all stand up for that thing individually, then those things cease to matter anymore. I don't know. That's it. And I tell people all the time, I'm not a fighter. I don't like people not liking me. I like to build bridges, and I don't raise my voice, and I try to be very diplomatic all the time. I'm not like someone who's in your face fighting all the time. There's people that just like the fight. That's definitely not me, but it just mattered that much to me. And for me, you're right. It's sort of disappointing to realize how few people will kind of stand apart from the group to stand up for what they believe in, if they believe in anything. Most people, what they believe in is standing with the group and deriving some sense of virtue and kind of moral certitude from being with the group. The Milgram experiment, like time and time again, we've seen this play itself out. People will obey authority and do the wrong thing if it's, delivered on high from, an authoritative source. For me, it was freeing to kind of accept that look, it's maybe 5% of people who are going to be willing to stand apart. You can bring people along over time, but you need those first few people to stand up and stand apart. I should also say, look, I'm lucky. I did very well as a corporate executive for many years. Losing my job is not the end of the world. I'm not looking at not being able to feed my family. I do need to work. It's not an option for me not to work for the rest of my life, but I definitely had a cushion and could take the risk. And I understand that some people certainly cannot do that.
Yeah, but at the same time, you're in a position where you can be a sort of rallying cry for other parents too, who perhaps do want to speak out and are afraid of facing the repercussions of that. I'm not a parent, and I'm not in a position where I have an entire career to lose for what I say. A lot of my career has been built in places where people agree with the things that I say, or at least are friendly enough to it that I'm not going to lose anything over it. And even I'm in a position where, COVID was a real moment of sort of solidification for me around, well, am I willing to say what I think, even at the risk of my family not agreeing with me anymore, or losing some old friendships?
Don't you think it was ironic? You're living in the space that perhaps is more freedom focused than maybe where I was. But during COVID, every space was risky if you opposed the lockdowns and the restrictions. I have a few friends who are, self-avowed lifelong libertarians, and they're like, the libertarians failed. They were all in on lockdowns and even vax mandates in the beginning. It's sort of this moment that they should have been ready for their whole lives. And in the face of fear, most people abandon their principles, I think.
Yeah, I think COVID was the moment in a number of people's heroes' journeys where they had to face, am I willing to stand up for the things that I believe in, no matter what the cost? Obviously, you were one of those people. And I think other people seeing that is very bravery-inducing.
Well, that's what I hope.
I think it is.
Well, the thing about it also is this is what makes me sort of crazy. If everybody who was sitting there in their minds asking questions going, is this bad? Is this the right thing? Should we really be doing this? Are we causing more harm than, good? And most people were willing to accept the first 2 to 3 weeks. I wasn't, but most people were fine. A lot of people started scratching their head after a month. Even if we weren't a majority, if we were a sizable percentage, the vilification wouldn't have been possible. Do you see what if we were 40%, I was like the only one in San Francisco with my husband. That makes it very easy to paint someone as a lunatic. If it was half the city, not so much.
But anyone who listens to you talk, is going to realize immediately that you're not a lunatic and that you're very grounded and measured and have very articulate points to make, and you make them very calmly, and you were willing to accept the consequences of what you said, and publicly facing, at least you've accepted them very gracefully. And I think that's like watching someone go through the thing you're afraid of and watching them come out okay the other side, I think is also very important. Like, we're mimetic creatures. We copy other people who have set an example for us. So if you want to be brave and you're afraid of the consequences, and you watch other people being brave and standing up and saying the thing that you're not sure you want to say, and you watch those people be okay after saying it, I think that makes other people braver to say the same thing. I'm sometimes a bit optimistic, but I think that's certainly been true for me. Watching other people say things and be okay saying them certainly has emboldened me.
No, I think that's right. And then finding community and, those willing to kind of take a little step and stand apart and bring others along. The community I've found of people willing to do that, I would say are, those are my friends. Those are my friends now. That kind of courage is, it is contagious. But more than that, we needed that community because we had risked friendships and being ostracized by our colleagues at work, by family members in some instances. And, I can't tell you how frustrating it is at times when you're sort of, because I'll say this. When I was writing my book, Levi's Unbuttoned, I went back to look at the tweets, that I was getting in so much trouble for and that I was being called all these horrible names for. I was thinking, I'm going to find something where I lost my temper and I sound like a loon, or I sound really mean, or I curse. Nothing. Nothing. Calm, rational. And people look at them now and they're like, you didn't even do anything. You said school should open. Everybody knows that. And I'm like, let me take you back to March 2020 or even March 21. Saying that in San Francisco was like a kiss of death. You were suddenly, the things I was accused of, a racist, a QAnon conspiracy theorist. Some of these things I was like, what is QAnon? I didn't even know. I don't even think it's real still. I was an anti-vaxxer. I was an anti-masker. I was anti-trans. I was anti-everything you could be. And certainly these are not things you want your brand president at Levi's to be, right? But the name sticks. It can be completely unfounded. Think about this. People ask me now, how could they call you a racist for wanting schools open? It was the Black and brown children that were harmed the most. This was the twisted logic of that name calling. It was, if you want the schools to open, which are disproportionately populated by Black and brown children, you don't care if those children die. It's so dumb on its face that I just couldn't not say anything. It's just so stupid. And I used to, in the beginning when the names were coming at me, I used to try to explain why I wasn't those things. This is what I tell people. I would try to say, no, here's why I'm not that. I don't bother anymore. It isn't meant to start a conversation when they call you names. You have to compartmentalize it. You have to set it off to the side. All it's meant to do is to shut you up because you're so afraid of the name. And if it doesn't work for you, it will shut everybody else up because they don't want to be called that name. It's reputationally harmful, right? That's what gets you ostracized. That's what gets you kicked out of your job. But you have to laugh at it because it's so silly. I was called a Nazi sympathizer. I'm Jewish. It's ridiculous. So when you kind of get to the point where you can laugh at it and realize it's a tactic, whether they know it or not, it is a tactic. Because I don't think anybody actually believes that wanting schools open was racist or that I'm a Nazi sympathizer. I don't think anyone ever really believed that. So you have to just set it aside. That gives you a little more courage, but it's hard. I don't like it.
No, I think very few people do. Maybe true
My
internet
husband.
provocateurs.
My husband doesn't mind.
That's where I was going next.
Yeah.
One of the things, like I think there were a few things that made you uniquely positioned to also be one of the voices that was very strong through this. One of them was your history of advocacy for children, especially in gymnastics, which we can get into a little bit more in a little bit. I have some questions about that I'd love to ask you. But also your husband agreed with you and was very aligned on the position. And that's something I talk to a lot of parents who will reach out to me and say, I'm totally sold on X schooling model or whatever, but I have to convince my spouse. How can you help? And that's just for a decision within the family structure of where are we going to send our kids to school? How are we going to educate them? It's very different when you're taking a public stance or even just a moderately public stance among the extended family or something where you're saying something that's a bit controversial. You really need the support, and it's really hard when even your spouse isn't backing you. And you are in a really fortunate position where you and your spouse seem to be very aligned on this.
Yeah. I mean, he has a very different tone of voice than I do. He's much more aggressive. He was more provocative. He talked about a broader range of issues from the very beginning, which I was aligned with, but didn't, like I said, I was trying to strategically manage my advocacy and reputation, which I do less of now because I don't have a job. But it was really meaningful to be able to kind of be at home when the city had gone mad and look at each other and go, okay, I know the entire world is against us, but I got you. We're not crazy, right? We see this the right way. We look at the data. We're looking at this. Even if you're not looking at the data, this is, these are egregious civil rights violations, data aside. But when you look at those two things in conjunction, it's sheer madness. And, in the beginning, gosh, I can't even sort of take myself back to the position, but it was like everything they were telling us, meaning, the media and the government, it wouldn't come true, and then they just move the goalpost and lie about the next thing and lie about the next thing. And I kept thinking, what if I'm wrong? They're going to be right one of these days, right? Suddenly it's going to become catastrophic and maybe all the children are going to die of COVID. Nothing they said was true, nothing. At a certain point, you're like, okay, they're wrong about everything. They're just wrong. And so I had less doubt after about 6 or 8 months in. I think I had a healthy amount of doubt in the beginning. I think anybody who thinks they're right all the time is wrong a lot of the time. Which is why in the beginning, all I did was ask questions. I never said, I didn't come out guns blazing from the beginning. I was like, are we sure this is the right path? Are we sure the cure is not worse than the disease? Are we sure, which I think are all very reasonable questions. And now we've, of course, learned the answers to them. But as I saw things play out and everything, it was 2 weeks to slow the spread. Then it was 2 weeks to not overwhelm hospitals. It was, everyone's at equal risk. No, they're not. Then it was, okay, kids aren't at risk, but they're super spreaders. Okay, no, they're not. It's like it kept moving, and it was all in service of this narrative that everybody had to stay home and lock down forever until the vaccine. It seemed that that's what it was. And so in the beginning, it was very much about asking questions. And then I started to have a little more confidence that my takeaways were correct from the beginning.
So you tried for the first year, it sounds like, to protect your job. You thought you could do both. At what point did you realize that there was a significant possibility that you could lose your job at Levi's? And how did you decide to keep going, saying these things, knowing that risk?
Yeah. So, I started on social media in March of 2020. No one said anything to me at work until September of 2020. So there was just silence during that time. I mean, I was getting some vilification online. And to be clear, I was also attending school board meetings, and I started to lead rallies by the fall, and I wrote a few op-eds, started to appear on the local news in December of 2020. But no one called me or reached out at all to say, hey, cut it out. So I was like, maybe they don't notice or maybe they don't care. But I did get a call in September 2020, encouraging me to stop. And then I got a call from someone different every 2 weeks, legal, HR, whoever, a board member, you need to stop when you speak on behalf of the company. And I would kindly say, I don't, I'm just a mom. Yes, I have this title, but I'm not using it. I'm just a, mom of 4 public school children. And I felt like at that point I had a little bit of a leg to stand on because, like I said, they'd all sent their kids back to in-person school. By the spring of 21, by January, we became, my husband and I, very clear that the schools were not going to open in the spring, that it was going to go beyond a year. And so we decided to move, at least temporarily, so that our younger children could attend in-person school, because my son, who was 6 at the time, was struggling with it. We wanted him to have some kindergarten, so that his first year of school was not, staring at a screen like this. So we moved to Denver. I tweeted about it. That got some attention. And I ended up being invited to go on the Ingram angle, Laura Ingram. I agreed to do that. I am proud of everything I said. I'd do it again. I'd say it to her. She and I may disagree on some other things politically, but she was really ahead of the curve on this. I think she was the first national pundit to talk about it. And why do I have to agree with someone on everything just because, if I talk to them? So the backlash to that was very severe internally. And that's when serious email campaigns started. That's when I was told I needed to do an apology tour. That was the moment in time that I was like, okay, I might not keep my job. Why I decided to keep going, because it was sort of said to me at this point by my boss, the CEO, if you stop, maybe you could be CEO. At this point in my mind, I was like, there's no chance. Even if I stop, there's a year of tweets and op-eds and news appearances. If they want to get rid of me, they're going to get rid of me. I'm in for a dime, I'm in for a dollar at this point, because the only way this changes at this point, and I come off in a good spot, is if the culture changes and we come to some sort of realization that this was wrong. Then suddenly I'm okay. But if I stop my advocacy at this point, it won't save my job if the culture doesn't change. That's why.
You kind of have this Cassandra effect going on where you're just too early to the party on everything that you're calling. You were in that position with gymnastics. You were in that position with school closures. I want to talk a little bit about the gymnastics thing too, because again, this was you were in a position that I've heard you describe multiple times as being a position you're not terribly comfortable in, being the person who's dissenting and going against the grain and standing out and speaking out. And yet you did with gymnastics too. And I feel like that probably helped prime you to some extent to feel braver in
Definitely.
this position in COVID. Can you talk a little bit about the gymnastics
Sure.
advocacy and what made you want to stand up in the first place there too? Because that's also a difficult position to put yourself in.
Yeah, that was, I had been a gymnast from the time I was 6 until about 19. And the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years of my gymnastic career was a really brutal training environment. That was the gym that got me to a national championship win. But it's hard to explain to people who have normal childhoods how brutally just cruel this culture was. Physical abuse. I trained on a broken ankle for 2 years, near starvation diet, fat shamed, the physical abuse in the traditional sense, slapping and hitting, that had stopped in the 70s. It did happen in the 70s. But, I was an 80s gymnast, but, we trained 8 to 10 hours a day, ate less than 400 calories a day, if that. Like I said, trained on broken bones, humiliated, constantly told we were garbage. And of course, there is sexual abuse in the sport, which has been exposed. So I was not sexually abused, but I was around it. We knew the coaches were. The national team coach, who I traveled all around the world with, was a known sexual abuser. No one said anything. He was very well respected as a coach, so you knew not to say anything. You knew you wouldn't be listened to. So 20 years later, I'm in my late 30s, about to turn 40. I have 2 children. I'm pretty successful. And I'm still sort of suffering the repercussions of that kind of abusive culture. I'm good, right? I'm married. I got 2 kids. I have a career. But sort of self-esteem issues, anxiety issues. Coming out of the sport, it was really bad. Like, PTSD symptoms, eating disorder got much, much worse, anorexic, and then bulimia. And it was just really hard to find my footing. Like, if you're told you're a piece of garbage for most of your childhood, you sort of believe it. You just do. And it's really hard, even if you know better, to overcome that. And so when I sat down to write the book, I was certainly doing much better than I was in my early 20s, but I was still struggling. And so it really was just me trying to make sense of it. That's it. I didn't think I would get it published. I wasn't a writer. I was a marketer at Levi's at the time. I was a successful gymnast, but not a famous one. It's not like I was Mary Lou Retton or Dominique Moceanu or some of these gold medal winning gymnasts. Didn't have a ghostwriter. I just sat down to write it to make sense of it for myself. And while I knew it would be controversial, I didn't really think it would be as controversial as it was, because I thought we all knew. We all talked about it, But I ended up getting it published, much to my surprise. And it ended up being very controversial and provocative. It came out in April of 2008, right before the Olympics. And the U.S. Olympic Committee and USA Gymnastics and the machinery just went in place to smear me as just a loser who didn't know anything and was now just grifting, trying to make money, which I didn't need to do. I had a successful career. I don't think people know how little money you make writing books, unless you're like Michelle Obama or something. It's not you have to do it because you have something you want to say. It is not a money-making proposition. And so you have to also remember that was early days of social media. So I didn't know about trolling. I didn't know about any of this. I signed up for Facebook just because my book was coming out. I'd never been on social media. So the cruelty, and the just absolute horrific name calling was a shock to me. And I didn't really know how to manage it. Now I know, you mute the responses, you don't look. But it wasn't just social media. I mean, I'd be on the radio and people would call in and threaten to sue me, people that I knew that I had trained with. So It was like real life too. It wasn't just social media. I mean, this woman who I am now good friends with again, when I did a national radio appearance on NPR, she called in at the end and said, basically everything I was saying was slanderous, libelous about these coaches. And I was just in it for a buck. And I knew who it was as soon as I heard the voice. I said, "Hi, Jessica. I'm sorry you have a different takeaway from the experience, but this is what happened." And it's interesting. About 3 years later, she called me on the phone and she said, "You were right about everything." I couldn't face it. She had been sexually abused by one of our coaches. She had been ignored when she brought it to other adults. And she just hadn't, she built a wall, We're friends now. But it was, my point is it wasn't just social media. It was kind of real life too. And no one else spoke out about it. But I think, again, I didn't go in trying to start a fight or be provocative. I was just trying to make sense of my own experience and my own story. And in the early days when I was interviewed on the morning shows and TV and stuff, I would say, I would try out of self-protection to say, this isn't an indictment of the sport. This is just my story. I was trying to, and then I eventually became emboldened over time. And I was like, yeah, this sport is rotten to the core. It is an indictment of the sport. Far too many kids are abused as a matter of course. But in the beginning, I was in self-protection mode.
Well, it's really painful to be one of the first people to see something for what it is and to speak out about it. Because it's also to your friend's, what she said when she called in and the fact that she wasn't willing to face it. I think that's pretty common too, that when you start attacking something or even just questioning something, that's a very core, integral piece of someone's life or even society at large, like the school system. It feels like a personal attack to a lot of people, or it brings into question things that they're not willing or ready to face. And so it gets very difficult to have conversations about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think for a lot of us, who grew up in the sport, it was really damaging. And we also had really good things happen. I'm very proud of the fact that I won a national championship. And so you can choose to just remember that and try to put the other stuff aside, but it kept coming back for me, in like nightmares and all sorts of other ways, continued body dysmorphia, although that dissipated by my 30s, but that's a long time. That's 10 years after I was out of the sport. And just a general feeling of like never being good enough, just real like imposter syndrome and all of just always feeling like everything was my fault. Relationships, if they didn't work, were my fault. I mean, I would like at work, if something went wrong, it had nothing to do with me. I would say, oh, I'll take responsibility. Like that's how it was crazy. So it just was like affecting my life. And for me, writing it down was the way, to deal with that. It wasn't an especially brave or courageous act, but I did have to gather my courage as I was attacked, and I became stronger and more courageous, and then I think with the Nassar story breaking, which is such a horrific, colossal, illustrative example of what was happening in the sport, that's when I sort of came to this realization that the truth does out in the end. And if you see it first and you say it, people will come and join you over time. You just have to steel yourself against the backlash in the meantime.
You alluded to some of the negative things that you picked up from being a gymnast at the level that you were at for so long. What were some of the positives or like assets that you got from training in a sport? Because this is another thing that comes up a lot in conversations about education. It's like, well, how much should we put our kids in sports? How much should we put our kids in sports? Yeah. What were some of the upsides for you?
I think sports are great for kids. My two younger children, 8 and 6, both play sports. They love it. Healthy bodies, healthy minds. You learn that if you can't do something in the beginning, if you work hard enough, you can learn how to do it. So there's this continuous learning process. I think team sports are great. I did not play one, but learning to be part of a team. I think just having something to do that you care about that, makes you want to get up in the morning and keeps you motivated. And, that's everything for kids. Otherwise, what are they doing in the afternoon after school? They're either on a screen or getting up to no good once they get older. I think just having something I really cared about. I wanted to be the best gymnast that I could be. Nothing was going to get in the way of that. I made that a priority. Now, I did that to a level that was like bordering on mental illness at a certain point. But I think caring about something enough to focus on it and work really hard at it. Learn that, if you fail, you can get up and you can succeed the next time. Because we had to do that, not just in competition, but every day in the gym. You watch gymnasts and you see them do a trick, is what we call them. They weren't able to do that the first time. Some of these skills take years to learn. You have to keep trying, and you just learn that if you keep at something, you can do it. I think that's great. I think there is a certain kind of mind-body connection too. I find people that have no physical activity growing up don't realize that to be mentally healthy and happy, emotionally healthy and happy, you need to move your body. All those things I think are great. And I love that my kids play sports. I think what I tell parents who ask me the same thing, I don't want sports to eclipse my children having an actual childhood. So I didn't really have a childhood. If you're training 6, 7, 8, 10 hours a day in the summer, you don't have a childhood. I don't think having a career in something before you're 18 years old is necessary. I think a diversity of experiences is important when you're young to figure out what you like to do and what you might be good at. And that doesn't mean you can't be competitive. Doesn't mean, it also doesn't mean, you can be an athlete at the state level and have all the same terrible experiences. It's really about the coach's philosophy. Are they interested in developing the whole child? And is your child happy? They can be disappointed that they lost or didn't perform their best, but are they happy? I clearly was not. I became very depressed at around 15 or 16. And then my physical body was deteriorating because I had so many injuries and I had an eating disorder. Anyone who was paying attention would have known that I was circling the drain. So I don't know, it's that line. And I think understanding the coach's philosophy is the most important thing.
because especially in high school, you were training many hours a day after school every day. And you and I talked about this a little bit the last time we spoke about some of the implications of that. What are some of the things that you feel like you missed out on, or that you maybe were extra careful about defending in your own children's adolescence because of the experience you had?
I mean, I didn't even go to school full time, which is fine, but I didn't need to. I went to a school that let me out early in high school so that I could train because, we started at 1:30. If I had gone to the typical public school in our community, they wouldn't let me out early, which meant I had to do gym in school, which was stupid, study hall, which was unnecessary because I was a hard studier. What did I miss? I mean, I missed everything. I didn't have friends in school. I didn't have any of the sort of normal milestones. I didn't socialize with kids at school. I didn't go to football games. I didn't go to dances. You can say all that stuff is dumb. I think it matters. I think all that stuff matters, interacting with your peers. The only friends I had were other gymnasts, and we were competitors. So, how friendly are you? We're friends now, but you have to remember that was the dynamic. Your best friends, the only ones who could understand what you were going through, were also your competitors, and you were not going to share your suffering, your weakness. And so the only people that could have related to how you were suffering were people you were not going to share it with. And some of us have talked about that since, that we wish we had. Family vacations, family holidays. I trained 6 days a week. So, I had Sundays off. Eating, I didn't eat. I don't know. It's not like I need to be going to parties all the time, but I think some degree of normal socialization is important for young people. I think the other thing that's important is sort of individuating from your parents. And, gymnastics, obedience was just instilled in us. We were made very childlike, not just physically, but emotionally in many ways. Physically, we put off maturation through starving ourselves, but emotionally, we never had that sort of pushback against authority figure or our parents. We were just in the gym, disciplined all the time. And so I did that later when I was 20, 21, 22. But I think that's a healthy process to have when you're a teenager, where you start to push back on the rules a little bit, on your parents, and define yourself as you see yourself. That's normal.
Yeah, well, your teenage years are the preparation for adulthood, when you're supposed to be making decisions on your own. So if you're getting zero practice until you turn 18, and then all of a sudden you're expected to go be an adult and make life decisions, it's a real disconnect.
You just said it so well, and I used to talk about this a lot, but there were no questions every day about what I was going to do. I was going to get up, I was going to go to school for 4 hours, and then I was going to go to the gym and train as hard as I could. It didn't matter if my fingers were broken or my ankle was broken, or if I was tired or hungry, I was going to train. And if I handed myself over to my coaches, that was going to be the best possible outcome, right? I had to make no decision. I remember going to college and it was like, can someone just tell me what to do? I don't know how to pick a class. I don't know what I want to do. I don't know what I want to do tonight. I had no idea, because I had just had this ironclad schedule and framework for how to live my life. I made no decision. So that was very difficult. I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know what I liked. I didn't know what I liked to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I never thought about liking something being important. And I was a very good student, but not a very committed and engaged student. So even figuring out what interested me academically, school was something to get through so I could go to the gym. So I got to college and I went to Stanford, really lucky, and met all these smart people who were these deeply engaged students, very curious. And I was like, I haven't read any books. I don't know anything. I was sure they were going to kick me out. I was like, they're going to figure out she's the dumb jock and they're going to kick her out. But I found my interests. But that was hard. I didn't really know what I liked outside of the sport, and I didn't like the sport anymore. So I felt like I had nothing.
How did you find your interests?
I think I became in college, I was still a very tentative student. I was afraid to speak in class. I felt undereducated, I guess, in a sense, versus some of the other people I was meeting. But I became a pretty passionate reader. So I kind of found some interest there. I became somewhat political and politically activated. I sort of declared my feminism, I think, which in the simplest sense just meant to me that equal rights for women, equal pay. Yeah, I think it's been morphed and everybody has a different meaning, but I was like, well, who doesn't agree with that, equal opportunity for women. And for me, so much of what I had been through had a certain misogynistic quality to it. And so that was very helpful for me to try to recover from my eating disorder. This idea that my value wasn't how I looked and what I weighed, that felt very sexist to me. Men aren't usually valued for their looks in the same way. So I became somewhat politically activated. And I just found a community of friends. And I got a little rebellious, that was good to kind of maybe not do what was expected of me all the time and realize I was still going to be okay.
It's a developmental stage for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. I just went through it a little later than some people.
Yeah, I find this part of your story actually really interesting, particularly because I talk to a lot of people who obviously you had a much more extreme and damaging experience going through the gymnastics world that sounds like a very painful experience every time I've heard you describe it. But a lot of people, I think, still come to the end of their teenage years describing their sense of lack of direction or lack of sense of their own interests using somewhat similar language around I went through a system that wasn't catering to me somehow. It wasn't mapping onto my interests or my needs, or maybe I went through school and I wasn't good at school. So I kind of felt like the dumb kid. And then I grow up and I'm like, well, I don't even know what I'm good at or what I want to do. So hearing you talk about how you went through this process in a circumstance that has a lot of stark contrasts to it. So it's very easy to see the black from the white and the different shades of what's going on is really interesting to me. I
think the thing that, you asked me what was the positive. I think what I felt very lucky to have known as a young athlete is the love of something, and I wanted to have that again. I felt angry that I found it once and now I had to find it again. When I went to college, in my freshman dorm, I was housed with all these other athletes who became professional athletes. They were great child athletes and they became professional tennis players, football players, and baseball players. And I was pissed, man, because I was like, I was as good as you in my sport and I have to find something else. And you get to do this for the next 10 to 15 years and make a living. And some of them became, like I said, professional tennis players who it was a career, a lucrative career. And so I was in this weird spot, because I was mad, but I also hated the sport and I wanted nothing to do with it. But I was like, God, crap, I got to find something else now. But I knew I am not a person who can just do something in a half-assed way. I needed a break and I was going to take a break and rebel a little, but I was going to get back to doing something that I loved. I just didn't know what that was.
I want to go back to one of the places we started this conversation, which was you as a public school mom, because there are a few things about this that are also really interesting. The first is just how unique your position is as someone who, as you described, most of your peers at Levi's were living in gated communities, sending their kids to private schools. And you're, living on a city block, sending your kids to school with everyone who's in the local area, regardless of what their parents do for a living or what their familial structure is like or anything like that. And I find it very interesting that you felt so strongly about that when obviously most of your peers feel very strongly in the opposite direction. You talked a little bit about you wanted your kids to have a sense of their city and their neighborhood, not just their particular socioeconomic class or status, Was that the biggest reason why you wanted to send your kids? I have a bunch of questions about the experience of public school and your perspective on it, but was that the biggest reason why you wanted them to go to public school, or were there other factors?
Well, I mean, I do want to go back because my oldest son started school in like 2005. Like we in no way had the money to send him to a private school. I mean, not without literally, eating potatoes every day. Like we just didn't, we weren't. I worked, my ex-husband now. My husband didn't. He stayed at home. We just weren't in a position where that was viable. We didn't have family that was going to help us, which is true for a lot of people that do that when their children are young. It was also, this is another case. It was very important to my ex-husband as well. And without going into why and his experience, because that's his, and I don't want to, invade anyone's privacy. We both felt strongly. And again, I think when you look at someone, your spouse at home, and you say, this is what we're doing, that kind of gives it, weight. If I was married to somebody else who said, I don't know, that school, Hamlin, looks pretty, well, that's a girls' school, but, whatever, that school looks pretty good. Why don't we try it? I might have kind of been convinced, but we both had a similar start place and then agreed. And then you had the financial situation, which was not very viable. As I moved up at Levi's, it became more viable, but we were happy in the school system and our children were doing well there. So there was no reason to. We liked, one, they were doing well in school. They had all their friends there. And we liked, they had a great mix of friends from all different backgrounds. And that just seemed important to me. I mean, think about it this way. The private schools, they all have scholarship kids that they take in. Partly they say they're doing that to try to be nice and do the right thing, but partly it is they tout this sort of diverse student population, which it's not really, but they see value in it. They have to manufacture it. It's not manufactured in the public schools. It's real. And I also just feel like, you know what? Yeah, there's some kids in these schools that have a really tough home life, and they might come into the class and not always be well behaved. So deal with it. You think you're going to meet people who are always going to behave appropriately? I thought that was important, to be in an environment where there's people from all different backgrounds. And, I don't know. It just seemed important to me. I don't know why you want to raise your kids in a situation where everything is so pristine and perfect that they have no understanding of what the world is like.
What have been your perceptions of public school, first of all, between your older kids and your younger kids?
Yeah.
Because has there been a shift in the nature of the experience that they're having, but also what are the pros and cons of it in your mind?
Yeah. I mean, my older children went to the neighborhood elementary school in San Francisco. So by the time they were about 9, they were walking themselves, which I think there's value in that in terms of developing independence. It was also a little bit of a special elementary school. They called it arts-based learning, which really in the 2000s they had abandoned, but they still had art, which none of the public schools did anymore. And my older boys are both artists. One is in fact getting his Master of Fine Arts right now. The other is starting art school in a couple weeks. And so I think it instilled in them a real passion for the visual arts. They had art class since they were in kindergarten. That was reinforced at home. So we had a great experience there. Then they went to the neighborhood middle school, great experience there. School was more I got to go back in time here, right? This is 2008, 2009. They were focused on history, reading, math. There wasn't a lot of the same focus on social and emotional learning, SEL. There wasn't the same focus on some of the more divisive curriculum that we see now. That was not happening. They were focused on the school subjects. And my kids did well. They tested well. My oldest ended up going to Berkeley, which is a great public university in California. So we had a great experience. I worked. My husband was home. He was very involved in the PTA. And, we were there at all the events in the schools. And we felt part of the community in our school. I don't know. I had a good experience. With my younger ones, they've never attended San Francisco public schools because when we were set to start is when the closures happened. We moved to Denver. We're in a public charter here. It's a Spanish immersion charter. They both speak Spanish and have gone to a Spanish language preschool since they were 2. And we really like it. The charter schools here in Denver are part of the public school system. I know they function differently everywhere, but here, like, there's 2 board members that are charter representatives on the school board. They're on the same schedule. But I think the fact that it's Spanish language, and a lot of the kids, it's second language, it's not that they're native speakers. I think this keeps them very focused on learning the language and the curriculum. There's not a lot of time for other stuff. At least that's my observation so far.
Did you choose Denver specifically because you liked their school system, or how much of a factor did that play? Were there other public school systems you thought about when you were leaving San Francisco?
We chose, the first sort of point of decision was, are the schools open? So, yeah. We wanted a Spanish immersion school, so they had one. And I also was still working at Levi, so I didn't want to be too far away. I wanted to be able to fly there and back in one day if I needed to. We were working virtually, but I had some in-person meetings. I didn't want too big of a time change because I was working virtually. Like, if I was on the East Coast 3 hours, that would have made my day too crazy. And I wanted to be in a city because I had lived in San Francisco for 30 years and I was not ready to move to a rural community.
That's fair. How has everything that's happened over the past couple of years affected the way that you parent, specifically around like how you talk to your kids about some of the things that have happened to you and some of the things that, with Levi specifically, and speaking up about COVID, like, obviously this has impacted their lives too. They moved because of this, but I imagine on a much more meta level, this also changes the way you think perhaps about the world you're preparing your kids to step into. It's a very different world than it was even a decade ago, or, let alone just pre-COVID.
Yeah.
But, we live in this world now where there kind of is no statute of limitations on what you say on the internet. You can get fired for things that you said a decade ago. We live in a world where people are often very divided on things that don't really seem like they logically should be points of division and animosity. And we don't obviously know how things will evolve. It's been quite unpredictable up to this point. But I know this is something a lot of parents think about is, well, how is this going to impact my kids? What do they have to be good at in order to navigate the career landscape, land a job, but also hold their own in places where it's not necessarily comfortable to do so? I'm really curious. It seems like you've thought through all of this a lot for yourself, but I'm really curious how you narrate it back to your younger kids, but also how you talk to your older kids about it too, who are, they're about to go face it.
Yeah, and they're grown. My oldest lives on his own in New York, and my 20-year-old is with me, but he's about to go to New York. And they don't agree with me and my husband, who's their stepfather, on most of this. It was very challenging for a while, and there was a lot of conflict when all of this was more heated. But we've found a way to agree to disagree and enjoy each other's company. And, my son's been here with me for the last, 8 or 10 months. It's been amazing to have this time with him. And I listen to him listening to his podcasts and roll my eyes, and I'm sure he hears the things I listen to and rolls his. But, he's my kid. And I think you asked, or you mentioned before, we got online, what's your philosophy of parenting? It's pretty simple. It's your kids need to know that you love them no matter what, and that they can always come to you. And you need to sort of get out of the way and let them figure out who they are and give them the opportunity, not sort of instill your belief system on them necessarily. Like, what do they love? What do they like? My kids are both artists. I am not an artist, but it became very clear when I gave them the space to do what they loved that this was something they loved. Could I have, I'm not sort of forcing, values isn't the right thing, because I do think you instill certain values, but the values are know yourself, do what you love, stand up for what you believe in. It doesn't have to be the same thing I believe in, But I think if they know that you love them and you've given them the space to be themselves without letting them kind of drive off a cliff, right? Having some guardrails, then you can have a really positive relationship as adults, even if you don't agree on everything. I think some people forget that your relationship with your kids for most of your life is with them as adults, not with them as toddlers. And so how do you sort of steer and navigate towards that so you can have a healthy relationship when they're adults and they can count on you and they help you when you need it potentially. So that's it. I think everything else in parenting is at the margins if you do those two things well. It doesn't matter when you introduce food or how long you breastfeed or which school you take. Yeah, like it's all at the margins if you do that and do it well. As far as, so, they don't agree with me, that's fine. We have found a way to kind of get along. The younger ones, they're so young, they're 8 and 6. They were 6 and 4 when we moved here. They imbibe a bit more of our COVID ranting and take it on as their own, but they're young. I think what I want for them is to have something that they love to do, that they're passionate about. And I want them to think for themselves and be willing to take a position that may be uncomfortable. It might be that it differs from mine. It might be that it differs from all their classmates. My daughter, who is 6, she's my only girl. She has my husband's personality, and I can already tell she does not mind standing apart and being different from everybody. She just don't care. So that one's going to be easy with her. I think the other point I would make is all your children are different and you have to parent them differently to some extent. Ruth, I am not going to need to encourage to not be afraid to stand apart. I am going to need to encourage her to do her homework. So, whereas my older, my 20-year-old, I was like, stop studying. You did 10 times the extra credit already. Like, it's enough. You're putting too much pressure on yourself. Go have fun. Every child is different, and there is not one style of parenting that is going to work for each child. But that's what I like. I want them to know they're loved. That I want them to have a passion, and I want them to be willing to stand up and fight for what they believe in.
I think that's very well articulated. I agree with everything that you just said, and I think a lot of parents, I get the sentiment a lot, especially on Twitter, where you and I both spend a lot of time, that parents really want to raise children, especially given everything that's happened over the past few years and sort of the milieu of the culture at large. They want to raise children who aren't afraid to think and know how, and children that aren't afraid to be brave.
Yes.
When they have to be, in a variety of contexts, everything from, personal life things to situations like the one you found yourself in, where you have this weird moral dilemma where it's like, well, I could lose everything that I work for if I say this thing. But if I don't say this thing, then what does that make me? And what am I complicit to by staying silent? And I think you can't make people be brave. No. And you can't force your children to become brave. Exactly. That's where I was going, is you can model these things. You can model, you talked about how, you, from the beginning with COVID, you were reading the footnotes and you were reading the sources because you wanted to know how these things that didn't seem to add up were making sense, or how the conclusions were being drawn. And that's a behavior that you can model, that your kids can pick up on and copy. But you can't force them to do that. You have to show them. You can show them bravery. You can model it for them. And normalize you can also love them. Yes. Yeah, you can normalize it. You can love them, and you can make sure they know that if they stand up and they say something to you that you don't agree with, you're still going to love them through the process of their development.
I think that's the thing, is if you're encouraging bravery and you're encouraging them to think for themselves, they're not always going to agree with you. And that's okay, So
that's part of the point. If they agree with you on everything, you're not doing your job correctly, because you've set yourself up as the thing that they're miming, but they're still just miming. They're not capable of going out and having their own thought.
Right. They're not thinking for themselves. And they are going to be informed by their generation and what their peers think. Look, I think differently than my parents. We all do. I think we share many of the same values, but I have different views on certain things, politically, socially, all kinds of stuff. And I think, in addition to modeling that sort of courage and willingness to stand apart, I think you model all sorts of behaviors. Do you have a passion? Is that important in your parents' life? Do I want to have a passion, something I really care about? I think you can also model sort of disagreeing agreeably. You don't have to make
Yes.
someone your mortal enemy just because you disagree on some things. You can disagree, express that diplomatically, and still come together for family dinners, or still come together at the holidays. And that's what I have tried to model with my husband. And it's interesting because it's been rockier with my family, but my husband's family, they're very close, and I have never seen a family put family first more than they do. And we didn't agree on a lot through COVID. They disagreed with a lot of the things we were saying, but we always saw each other. We always were able to sit down together at Thanksgiving or Passover and break bread. And I think that's an important thing to model as well.
Before we wrap up, I also want to talk a little bit about the project that you're currently working on, because I think it's going to be of great interest to my listener base specifically. You're working on a documentary about the COVID lockdowns in schools in particular and the impact of them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I was just with my directing partner in an editing suite for a few days, working on a sort of a long trailer, which I'm hoping to release soon. It's called Generation COVID. We follow about 8 to 10 families and kids over the course of the last year and a half to see how they're doing in the aftermath. And it's a range of, kids in urban areas. We have rural areas. We have the West, the South, that we have all over the place, all kinds of situations. We have upper middle class kids. We have low income kids. And we really sort of examine and I think bring to life through the kids themselves the range of impacts. The learning loss, or what was it like for a kid with a learning disability to sit and have to do work on a computer? What was it like for a kid who was really committed to sports and playing football, and that was his way to get to college, and there were no sports for 2 seasons, and yet he watched his private school peers play. Those schools played sports. Those kids got scholarships, the ones who didn't need them. We have developmentally disabled child. We have just every, a young woman who faced severe mental health impacts from the loneliness and isolation. We have some really catastrophic stories, but most, we have one family who lost a child to suicide. Most of the stories are more within the frame of this was what happened to almost everyone who was kept out of school. And I think what's really important to remember is in March of 2020, pretty much every single public school shut down in the country, and they said it was 2 or 3 weeks. A year later, a full half of them were still shut down. Now, some were hybrid, and the school systems would say, oh, it was hybrid. But you know what hybrid was in, Los Gatos? It was 2 hours a week of school. That's not hybrid. That's school shut down. So, you had close to 25 million children a year later still in disrupted schooling, and they didn't have sports, and they didn't have, So I think through telling the stories through the children themselves, it really starts to hit home. And my hope is that we're just not telling the story and preaching to the, congregation, but that we are inviting other people in who perhaps saw it differently at the beginning. When you really look at and examine the face of the lockdowns and what it did to children, I don't know how you don't at least open your heart a little bit, even if you were super pro school shutdown. I mean, the harms are undeniable at this point. So that's the film. We're working on a trailer now. We're pretty much done shooting. We have one more family that we're going to film next week on the East Coast. And then we're just in full-on edit mode. And we're hoping to finish by the end of the year.
Amazing. I'm so excited that you're doing this for many reasons. This is a story that needs to be told, and it's a story that needs continuity too, because it got a lot of buzz in the news cycle early on. And then it's, I think a lot of what happened during COVID, which is an entirely separate conversation, but a lot of what happened kind of has gotten swept under the rug.
Yeah.
Where people are just,
move on.
They either, they're over it. They want to get back to their normal lives. They don't want to atone for what happened. They don't want to have to reckon with it. They're like, let's just get on with things already.
Yeah.
Which is a fair set of emotions to be feeling, but a lot of stories get forgotten to be told to their completion because of it. And so I'm really excited that you're telling these stories in particular, because this is a story that is not finished, and we'll be seeing the implications of it for decades.
That's what I was going to say. Like, and people might say, oh, well, lots of kids were fine. Yeah. But if you have 5% or 10% of kids that aren't fine, that it's literally forever.
Billions of children.
Exactly.
10% is 5 million kids. That's a lot of individual lives impacted.
That is a generational.
That's the entire student population of Texas. That's a lot of people.
Exactly. That's a generational catastrophe. And I believe that's what we're facing. And I think the harms are still playing out. We see chronic absenteeism at, all-time highs. Those kids aren't going to graduate. Or if they do graduate, it's because they're waved through and they don't have any basic skills. Where does that lead? We know that if a child can't read by the third grade, the likelihood of, drug abuse, being unemployed, even becoming incarcerated, those things go up, a gazillion fold, with every year that passes that child can't read proficiently. And that's kind of what we're dealing with. I've spoken to quite a few teachers and social workers who perhaps engaged a student population before that was, had learning differences. And they might have a class that was 1 or 2 years behind in reading, right? Second and third graders who aren't reading at all. Now it's fourth and fifth graders. The whole thing's been kind of pushed back. And it really is, it's a tragedy. And so I agree with you. I think it's important to tell the story. The other thing that's important to do within telling the story is bring people some hope at the end. And I think parents are activated. And that's been a really sort of encouraging part of the story is the activation amongst parents, whether it's to run for school board in their own community. Lots of parents are homeschooling now, whether it's just being more involved in their school and the curriculum. And, it's fascinating. People have run for office. Like, people are just activated, man. And I think that is so cool. And that's what really gives me hope. And some of the kids are as well, frankly, the ones that are older.
Yeah, there's a lot of momentum here right now. It's a very interesting and exciting time to be in a lot of different areas, but definitely caring about education is a big one. There's a lot of energy here. And I'm excited to see what comes of it. I'm very optimistic. I'm also kind of a chronic optimist, so I'm always optimistic about things, but I think there's a lot to be optimistic about here. There's a lot happening.
I think that's right.
But the stories need to be told. And so I'm really, really glad that you are.
I think, I'm of two minds. Like, I feel very optimistic because of the activation, and I feel very sad about some children that I really do think are going to be forever left behind. And I don't think there's enough attention and energy because they can be, we can get through this, but we need to acknowledge that there's a problem and that these kids need help. And that doesn't seem to be happening.
Yeah, I feel like we're kind of at an inflection point now. It's kind of the you have a democracy if you can keep it moment. It's like we have a movement if we can keep it. Yeah. We have a lot happening right now, but also, there's a lot of work to be done to help the kids that were hurt, to make sure it doesn't happen again, to make sure that, the movement around expanding options and choice and accessibility keeps moving forward so that we're not stuck in this situation again.
One of the interesting things, and maybe this is where I sort of find myself at odds with some of my new political cohort, is, in the sort of libertarian space, and I definitely good God, I don't want the government telling me I can't send my kids to school and I can't, public health monitoring my every move and what I can do. But I will tell you this, many of the families that we feature are, we have an immigrant family here in Colorado. We have several low-income families. These families cannot do it on their own. And for the kids that have kind of muddled through and sort of found their way back, there's always a third party of some sort that has been helpful, whether it's a coach or, we have worked with this nonprofit here in Colorado called Zero Dropouts, which is just this amazing organization that goes door to door. They work with the school system and they find out who hasn't been to school and they go door to door and they try to get these kids to come back to school. And then they are sort of counselors and advisors at the school level, helping the kids catch up on credit. So it's a coach, it's a mentor, it's Zero Dropouts. It's something some of these families, it's one of the families we've talked to, it's immigrant family. The mom works graveyard shift. The daughter, teenager, left home alone during the day with 2 very small children to manage their schooling, a somewhat abusive stepfather. That kid needed help to get back. the mom couldn't do it alone either, even, and so I don't know what the process needs to be there, but I just think it's too much to ask in many circumstances for these families to be able to do it alone, which is why I am a firm believer that the public school system needs to be strong. And I think school choice makes it stronger, because then there's competition. And I think there needs to be, these kids need help. The parents can't do it alone. The ones that are off track that need to get back on track. I don't know what form that takes. And in many instances, these kids have been very lucky and they have that coach or mentor in their life. They have super engaged, awesome parents too. But if both parents are working, 10, 12 hours a day just to make ends meet, they need some help.
Yeah, it's definitely a thing. I think there are a lot of interesting alternatives that are already emerging that people are working on, both to public school altogether, that would be, facilitated by school choice that parents could have access to, but also programs, like supplemental resources. There are so many different things, which again is an entirely separate conversation. We could spend another hour talking about all of that, but there's so much that's being worked on that I'm very excited about. And I think it's not a problem with one solution or even a handful of solutions. I think there are a lot of emergent solutions, which is why I'm so pro optionality, which is why the school choice movement's really exciting. But it can't be a singular thing. It has to be.
Well, it's not going to work. That's right. One size fits all. It's different for every family. And it's one of the things I get frustrated with in sort of social media, because even in my new sort of school choice mode, I do send my kids to public school and people yell at me. Why aren't you homeschooling them? What is wrong with you? Like, haven't you learned anything?
That's not fair.
It's like, dude, choice means you get to choose your own path. You choose your own adventure. Yep. It doesn't mean we all homeschool our children, which I don't think is right for our family. Fine. Mm-hmm. I think, again, if we could all kind of come together on the things we agree on and let people do their thing and not kind of disparage them and demonize them because they might make a different choice, that would be nice. I would like that.
Yeah, that this brings us back to where we started the conversation, which is, education's a thing that unites a lot of people who don't necessarily see eye to eye, but part of what makes this work, or what's going to make it work, is honoring the things that don't make us all see eye to eye. We're supposed to have choices. We're supposed to choose the one that's right for us. We're supposed to, this works if we allow a lot of different solutions to emerge.
That's right.
And if we, I think especially on a local level, really find support in communities that can help us solve the problems that we are facing on an individual level with our families, or the children that we're responsible for, and then on a scalable national level or even global level, because it's not really just a national conversation about education. It's kind of a universal thing.
Yeah.
We collectively figure out what works to solve the problems, but we execute it locally.
Yeah.
At least that's my current hypothesis.
I think that's correct. The needs in any community are different. It has to be a local solution at the end of the day. I mean, the community, the immigrant family I talked about is in Greeley, Colorado, which is, large Hispanic immigrant population. And the solutions for that community are not the same as they are in Denver. They're just not. They're different, Those families need a different kind of support. Most of the kids that we talk to there, they don't know anyone that finished high school, let alone college. Mm-hmm. That's a really different thing than a middle-class community in Denver, where your kids are facing other challenges, because there's all sorts of ways kids get in trouble here in Denver. And you need solutions for that. But optionality, I agree.
I'm terribly excited to watch your documentary. I'm the more I hear you talk about it, the more excited I get. Where can people who want to watch the documentary, which I will be sharing too for people who are listening when it comes out, I'm sure there will be plenty of references to it via Twitter and such. But where can people follow you? Where can people find the other work that you're doing? Where would you send them next?
Yeah, I think Twitter, I share everything there, which is just my name, Jennifer Say. And then I have my own website, sayeverything.com, and you'll be able to find the trailer there when I post it. And then I keep a Substack, which you can just find with my name. So I'll share it there too. I'll share it everywhere.
I feel like you really do have an aptonym for minus the spelling for someone whose whole story has been being brave enough to say the things that you need to say. I like that you're playing with that in the website title and such. This has been such a fun conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time for this.
Thanks, Hannah. It's good to talk to you.
We'll chat more soon. You've been listening to the Hannah Frankman podcast. Thank you so much for being here. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave a rating. Please subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, please like, subscribe, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. That's it for this week. I'll see you next week, friends.